Thank you, Peter. Thank you very much. It's really a great honor and pleasure to have this chance to come to Kentucky and to EKU's School of Justice and Safety. I like to travel, and I was particularly intrigued at the possibility of coming out to Kentucky. I like bourbon, I like horses, that's close. Also, teaching at a university that's pretty renowned for its radicalism in the bluest dot in the big blue state of California, I like to show my colleagues that I can come out to the red states and come back with most of me intact. And we'll see if that's true at the end of this. But most of all, I was really excited by the very idea of a school of justice and safety. I had known of many of your distinguished faculty members, but I guess I had never focused on the name of the school until I actually got the email invitation from Kevin Wisdom. And it really struck a bolt with me. And I think if you have had a chance to look at my CV, you'll see why. Throughout my career, I have sort of oscillated back and forth between crime and risk. I've written about prisons and the death penalty, and I've written about workers' compensation and social insurance. I've taught courses on criminal law and criminal procedure and courses on insurance law. These two things, accidents and crimes, have always drawn me. Now that's pretty deviant. Most people either get their jollies with crime or with accidents. They don't usually mix them. And I kind of imagined that I was a member of a unique religion that was following completely my own beacon until I realized that there's a church right here in Kentucky called the School of Justice and Safety, which brings these issues very much together. And I don't know how much on the ground they really do talk together. I'm going to imagine that they do, and I'm going to encourage that they should in what I say. So let's start just with the ideas of justice and safety. If you want to have some fun with a really low-budget way of doing research, just Google image the word justice and Google image the word safety, or whatever your favorite brand of search engine is. I don't want to be a proprietary agent for Google. And I think you'll find that rather strikingly different images come to you. Justice, by and large, for centuries, has been represented by these two symbols, the sword and the balancing beam. And as you can see from, this is actually a European courthouse, there's a sense of grandeur and stateliness. The state is a big part of criminal justice, and inevitably the citizen is in the position either of defendant or victim or witness in front of what's essentially a state sovereign practice. Although, as I know David Garland reminded you a few weeks ago, in America sovereignty is always a little more complicated. But contrast that with safety. Safety as an icon or an image tends not to bring the state to mind, although the state is obviously very much engaged with it. It tends to focus more on individuals and their own practices and their own responsibilities. As you can see in this poster designed for children to teach them about fire safety, there's a kind of a sense, obviously prevention is a very big focus of safety, whereas justice tends to be backward looking at events and judgmental in that sense. As you can see from the safety poster, there's a sense of active citizenship. The citizen of a safety regime is responsible for doing all kinds of things in their own to reshape the risks that they face. And so these are very different thoughts, very different ideas, and yet they each have a history. Justice has a very long history, and I think for a long time, and still now, it essentially means this. In Amsterdam, they had what they called Justice Day, usually about 4 times a year, and that would be their moment of capital punishment, penal execution. I know David Garland was just here talking about that topic. They didn't always just execute people. They also had various other scaffold penalties. But you pretty much get the flavor for what justice in this sense means. It's got strong figures of the state and the church. It has a mass following, but it is very much of a ritual of retribution. Now, it's true that in the 20th century, in things like penological modernism, the rehabilitative ideal, parole, probation, indeterminate sentencing, there was a move of criminal justice, or at least penal justice, towards something a bit different, but things come in and out of style, and in many ways in the last 25 years or so, we've remained fairly close to a retributive notion of criminal justice. I would also add that by and large, for Americans, justice is criminal justice. They are aware of the civil justice system. They do think about social justice, but when they think about justice, and if you just ask people what is justice, it's this kind of a procedure they have in mind. When we talk about safety and risk, I think we see a more distinctive historical evolution. And here I want to take a moment to sort of set out a sort of historical time frame or context for my remarks about our current situation that I think will be helpful. Some of you know the work of the sociologist Ulrich Beck. In his very provocative 1992 book, The Risk Society, Beck suggests that a major transformation has taken place in America and other advanced industrial societies. He's mainly looking at Europe, actually, in more or less the mid to late 20th century, and that suddenly risk emerged as a dispositive sort of category of judgment, of action, of knowledge. He suggests rather provocatively that it replaces class as the major vector of hierarchy, so that your relationship to risk rather than your relationship to wealth becomes the defining feature of your status in society. There's lots of great insight in that book. One of the points I want to dissent from, though, is the idea that suddenly we had a risk society in the mid-20th century. I would argue that if you look historically, and I'm drawing here on the work of historians like François Ewald, the French historian, and others, you can really see more or less three moments or three phases, if you will, of a risk society. Now, I mean risk society in just the same way Beck does, a society where not just specific hazards that come to pass, but actually the future probability of hazard, risk in that sense, probabilistic sense, becomes a visible part of the social order and one that government and private actors deal with and respond to. If we think about risk in that way, I think we really have to date risk society to more or less the mid-19th century with the rise of industrialism, especially in England, which is the first really advanced industrial society, and which very much has a politics and a legal struggle around risk in the 19th century. The paradigm, if you will, of that risk society, according to Ewald, is responsibility. The responsible individual is the way that we confront this world of increasing risk. If some of you have studied the history of civil justice, you'll know that in the 19th century and into the early 20th century, when workers were injured in a work accident, their only hope for receiving compensation was to sue their employer for a tort of negligence. And often these courts, I've written a bit about this, these courts would undertake a microscopic examination of the behavior of the worker. Say a worker, and this was very typical, was crushed by two train cars that he was helping to couple, coming together with the couple failing. You'd get opinions saying, well, if he had just kept his head down about 6 inches and been more aware of what this other train was doing, his head wouldn't have gotten squished. Well, for most modern people, that seems a little bit peculiar. We're used to thinking that industrial processes are so dangerous, so destructive in their potential output, that we don't really look to the individual as the primary notion of how to govern these kinds of risks. Instead, since about the end of the 19th century, right around the problem of work accidents, we have developed the notion of insurance and the idea that risks really belong to the whole society. So some of the first lawyers and social scientists to begin working on this problem in the 19th century began to collect statistics on work accidents. And they observed that every year, maybe more or less the same number of work accidents happened in the steel industry or in the railroad industry. And of course, this led them to say, well, it's not really the individual that matters. Yes, individual lapses in care can be found in every one of these instances, but they are so predictable. They are so inevitably a part of the way industrial society works that the way to govern that risk is by spreading it across the society. And of course, insurance, first workers' compensation, which was in a sense the first mass form of insurance, but also private insurance, especially in the United States in the 20th century, became a way, the primary way, I would argue, in which we address risk in the second phase, if you will, of risk society. And in this phase, according to Ewald again, the paradigm is, instead of responsibility, it's solidarity. It's we're all in this together. Some of you may remember, although I'm quite a bit older than most of you, the familiar television commercial for the Prudential Insurance Company in my era was "Own a piece of the rock," which was a way of saying, you know, even in a private economy, you protect yourself by joining up with larger collectivities that can manage risk more effectively. And I've represented this era of solidarity on this slide with a picture of John Fabian Witt's recent and excellent book, The Accidental Republic, which studies in some great historical detail the struggles around work accidents and how the kind of solidarity society that we came to have in the mid-20th century, Social Security, welfare, regulation, these familiar features of governance in the 20th century are associated with this solidarity phase of risk.